All right, everyone, thank you so much for being here at this session of the Library Instruction Tennessee Conference. LIT, as it's known, provides space for teaching librarians to network, discuss trends, issues, and innovations in library instruction and information literacy. We'd like to thank the Citadel Library for providing Zoom access for our conference. And I would like to note that this meeting is being recorded. By continuing to attend the session, you are consenting to be part of this recording. These recordings with captions will be posted on the LIT website after the conference. We also ask all attendees to abide by our code of conduct, which may be found on the About Us page of the LIT website. If you'd like to report an issue, please email us at libraryinstructiontn for Tennessee at gmail.com. We have disabled your microphone, so if you have questions for the speaker during this session, please place them in the chat box and we will include them in our Q&A period at the end. Again, email us libraryinstructiontn at gmail.com if you have technical issues. A survey will be emailed to you after the conference concludes. Please give us feedback, as we will use that to improve your experience. So this session is teaching with vulnerability, applying the values of pedagogy of vulnerability to our work as information professionals, presented by Jackie Fleming, Indiana University, Bloomington. And now I'll turn it over to Jackie. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my session today. I also want to thank the conference organizers for having me. I'm very excited and honored to be a part of this year's Library Instruction Tennessee Conference. So as was just brought up, my presentation today is titled Teaching with Vulnerability, Applying the Values of Pedagogy of Vulnerability to Our Work as Information Professionals. My name is Jackie Fleming, and I am the Visual Literacy and Resources Librarian at Indiana University, Bloomington. Before I get started today, I just want to share that I am a person who stutters. This means that I'm going to try to be as fluent as possible, but that won't happen through the whole presentation most likely. So I would like to thank everyone in advance for their patience with that. And if anyone has any questions or if I can repeat anything, please feel free to ask. That's no problem at all, and I'm happy to repeat things. I also have my email on this slide. If anyone thinks of any questions after my presentation, please feel free to email me. I would love to encourage that. And don't feel like you have to write it down right now. I have my contact information again at the end of the presentation. So now I will get started. So today I'm going to talk about my background a little bit and why I'm interested in vulnerability and pedagogy of vulnerability. I'm also going to talk about some definitions and basics of this specific pedagogical practice and draw some connections between vulnerability as a topic and the work that we are involved in as librarians and information professionals. And then I'm going to give some examples of what I'm calling vulnerability in action. And some of this is from the literature that I've kind of pulled out, and also some personal examples that I have from my own instruction practices and profession. So first, I just want to share my personal interest in this topic. So I became the Visual Literacy and Resources Librarian at IU Bloomington in August of 2019. And this was my first job out of graduate school, which means it was my first experience of going through an academic interview process. And as we all know, that's a nerve-wracking process for everyone. It's very anxiety-producing, and it's a long process. And a common part of academic interviews includes a phone interview and around a 20-minute presentation in front of your potential colleagues. For a stutterer, that is not easy. I have stuttered my whole life, and sometimes I've been more fluent than others, but during that process, I was not fluent at all. I was very nervous. I felt prepared, but the stress of the situation and the fear and the anxiety was just too much for me to handle. And for me personally, stress is a big trigger for my stutter. And that's actually common for people. So when I got this job, which I consider still my dream job, I was kind of floored. I had gotten through the phone process, the phone interview, which talking on the phone is difficult for me. And I got through stuttering in the interview process, and I still got the job. So that was a big accomplishment for me personally. And going into this job, I wanted to do my very best to prove myself and to excel. The first couple months were rough. My job includes presenting at conferences like this one, leading workshops in the library, teaching instruction sessions with students from anywhere from, 5 people to 100 people. And I was so nervous. I came into this job with a little bit of experience in teaching from graduate school, but that was it. And while I don't mind speaking in front of people, I do not like stuttering in front of people. And I really struggled getting my footing in that area. I had never had anyone come up to me and tell me that my stutter was a problem, but I would leave those situations feeling so deflated and lacking in just a lot of confidence, which was not helping me do my job. So I finally decided that I needed help. I needed to seek out speech therapy of some kind. Our campus is huge. There has to be resources. So I decided to seek out speech therapy for myself to give myself the strategies I needed to do my job well. So it was at this point that I decided to email a speech therapist at IU Speech and Hearing Clinic at the Bloomington campus. Through email, I was able to connect with Julia, who is pictured on the slide. Julia is an incredible person and a wonderful speech therapist. I know I'm biased, but I will say that she's the very best. I met with her for coffee, and she really just wanted to hear about my experience and what my interest in speech therapy was. One of the first things that Julia told me was that she could not stop my stuttering. In fact, that was not the goal. The goal would be to do something that's called easy stuttering to kind of help get through those moments and to help prepare you for speaking in front of people. So fluency was not the goal. And this floored me. I had never heard that it was okay to stutter or that it was, okay to not speak fluently. It wasn't even about that. It was about me as a stutterer and learning how to handle tricky moments of speaking. So immediately I was intrigued and I wanted to learn more. So at this point that I'm speaking to you all, I've been in speech therapy for about 2 years with Julia, and I work with graduate clinicians who are in school to become speech therapists. So it has been a really interesting and really engaging experience. I've learned so much. They knew I was a librarian, so they would give me articles because I love researching things. They would give me articles about advocates who are working in this area to normalize stuttering. I read about, President Biden and his stutter, and I listened to podcasts, and all of this really was encouraging to me and inspiring to me. And I wanted to advocate as a stutterer also. So the image on this slide is a screen caption from an interview that I did for IU Today, which is a newsletter that goes out to all faculty on our campus. Basically, this interview was about my experiences as a stutterer, becoming a librarian and trying to get help with my speaking abilities, and about the IU Speech and Hearing Clinic. I can tell you within hours of this being published, I had maybe 30 messages in my email box from people, faculty members across campus and other campuses with just the kindest and encouraging messages, telling me about their stories, and kind of just thanking me for my vulnerability. I was not prepared for that. I was very nervous about this interview because it was so vulnerable, and stuttering is such a vulnerable thing. You don't always have a choice in that vulnerability. And this was an opportunity for me to have a choice. So within hours, I had heard wonderful things from people. Within weeks, I had gotten emails from people not on our campus who had just Googled about speech therapy and come across the interview. So I was hooked after that. I had seen proof that being vulnerable in the right way to help people learn is powerful. And I wanted to be a part of that and kind of grow in that area. I also wanted to know if people in our field were talking about vulnerability. How are we incorporating that in our instruction or even in our progression as librarians? Is that something that people are talking about, learning about? So I started researching at this point to try to learn more. And this is where I came across pedagogy of vulnerability. And I'll just say that I do know about this, but I'm still learning and growing in this area. And I'm always curious to learn more about this topic. So if anyone has any reading recommendations for me or any comments about this presentation, I'm always open to getting emails or questions about that. But I'm going to talk about what I know now. So pedagogy of vulnerability was officially introduced into the literature by Edward J. Brattenmeyer, who is the Assistant Director of Scholarship Programs for the Center for Faculty Innovation and Professor in the Learning and Technology and Leadership Education Department at James Madison University. Brattenmeyer acknowledges that the values of vulnerability are not completely new to educational settings. There's a lot of overlap with other pedagogical practices, such as humanizing pedagogy and mutual vulnerability. These pedagogy of vulnerability is defined as an approach to education that invites invulnerability and deepen learning through a process of self and mutual disclosure on the part of co-learners in the classroom. So in this respect, the teacher and the students are considered co-learners. We're all learning together. In practice, a pedagogy of vulnerability introduces lived curriculum, also known as lessons learned from personal experiences, into the classroom. Brattenmeyer explains that if the educator opens up their identity to their students in a way that brings up their life for examination as part of the lived curriculum of the classroom, students will model that self-examination and go deeper into their learning. Learning becomes relevant, has value beyond the classroom, and it has value beyond the classroom. So this is perfect case scenario, right? When we use pedagogy of vulnerability, it's an opportunity for everyone to learn and grow in an active learning environment. Brattenmeyer also offers numerous assumptions one practicing pedagogy of vulnerability needs to understand about using vulnerability in the classroom. For the purposes of my presentation today, I'm calling these assumptions guidelines because that's essentially what they are for. And I also want to note that I don't include all of the guidelines in this presentation, but I did try to choose the ones that were most relevant for our profession. And of course, that's for time purposes also. I have Brattenmeyer's chapter in my resources page, so I definitely encourage everyone to check that out if they're interested in reading more. But for today, I'm going to talk about the ones on this slide. So the first guideline that I want to mention is that self-disclosure should always be relevant, selective, and purposeful. I illustrated this type of self-disclosure in the beginning of my presentation. The information that I am a stutterer was important for me to share because if it happens, I want everyone attending this presentation to know that that is the thing that's happening. I'm okay. You can ask me questions about it. I want everyone to understand what I'm saying. So I shared that because I was comfortable sharing it and it was for communication purposes. Self-disclosure in the classroom needs to have purpose, and communication purposes was my purpose in this situation. So another guideline I want to touch on is there is privilege and power and vulnerability, and this is really important to understand and to recognize. It's imperative to understand that not everyone is comfortable with vulnerability, and that's okay, right? We all come from different places and different cultures, and it's important to recognize that it's not something that people are universally practicing across the board. We need to work hard to create a community of learners in our classroom that recognizes the traditional structures of oppression at work and education, combat them, and count ourselves as learners with our students. So it's important to recognize that this is not something that everyone is comfortable with. Also, using vulnerability requires building relationships, assessment, and recognizing emotions, right? So emotions are always at play with vulnerability. We need to think about how our instruction is impacting our students and assess what we're doing. Also, it is a challenge for librarians. We don't always get the opportunity or the luxury of time to build those relationships. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but that is something that we really need to think about when using these educational practices. So these are some more guidelines that I wanted to touch on, and I do recognize that there's a lot of overlap. But I do want to say it's important to understand that you need trust for vulnerability to be effective, and that requires building a foundation of trust in the classroom. Again, this takes time. So in addition to this, understanding the potential impact of your pedagogical practices is very important. While vulnerability can increase the potential for deep learning, it can also be harmful if not used correctly in the right setting with the right foundation of trust. It's important for us to know that that is a possibility and that sometimes the risks of vulnerability outweigh the benefits. So we need to think critically about our practices before actually utilizing them. There are resources out there to kind of help navigate what I believe Brene Brown calls walking the vulnerability tightrope. I'm a huge Brene Brown fan, if you couldn't tell from my transitional slides. But one great resource to help with this is the American Psychological Association Code of Ethics. And I have that linked in my recommended reads. There's a great article that utilizes those. So we can reference these resources and these guidelines to kind of help us consider all the angles when wanting to incorporate values of vulnerability and pedagogy into our work. I brought up Brene Brown a little early. Here she is again. So I would be remiss to talk about vulnerability and not mention what I biasly call the amazing Brene Brown. If you couldn't tell from my transitional slides, like I said, I'm a big fan. And in her book, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Learn, Brown busts myths about vulnerability. And one of the myths includes that vulnerability means telling your whole story, or as Brown puts it, vulnerability is letting it all hang out. Vulnerability is not letting it all hang out. That is a myth. Brown explains that sharing appropriately with boundaries means sharing with people with whom we've developed relationships that can bear the weight of our story. The result of this mutually respectful vulnerability is increased connection, trust, and engagement. Vulnerability without boundaries leads to disconnection, distrust, and disengagement. So in summary, successful practices of pedagogy of vulnerability requires trust, boundaries, and the building of community. So now I'm going to draw, oops, sorry, my slide lagged there. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to draw some parallels between vulnerability and librarianship. And some of these are connections that I see happening, and some are the work of other librarians that are maybe not calling it vulnerability, but I see elements of vulnerability happening there. So what's the connection? Well, I see connections between, I'm sorry, this is out of order. I'm going to do the slide first if everyone doesn't mind, but I see connections between librarian educator identity and the principles of vulnerability. I can speak from my personal experience. I did not come to my current position with an educator's background. I had, classes on instruction where I was able to give presentations in class, but I didn't have that foundational knowledge or, quite frankly, know what a teacher identity was until I started my job. And research shows that this is kind of a common feeling. This is a common place where librarians come from. A lot of people feel that their education, their graduate education, was not necessarily sufficient in teaching about building a teacher identity. And that's vulnerable, right? It's vulnerable to come into a job and to maybe not know or have relevant experience in every area that you're expected to perform. So I kind of call this, being thrown on stage under the headlights and not knowing your lines, right? So if you don't have that practical hands-on experience and you don't have a scripted way to develop that teaching identity, it can be scary. But this is where I'm saying that librarians are masters of vulnerability, right? We learn on our feet. We find resources for ourselves. And the research does show that librarians build their teaching identities in a variety of ways. They build it by building a community of colleagues and asking for advice, which is also an act of vulnerability, asking for feedback. They do their own research. They look to the literature to see what other teaching practices people are involved in, and they engage in professional development opportunities. So vulnerability is happening in our field, whether we call it that or not. I'm going to go back a slide then because they were a little bit out of order. I'm sorry about that, but I wanted to point a little bit further to kind of drive home where I see vulnerability with building a teaching identity. So I see a connection between the values of pedagogy of vulnerability and the role of being a library educator when it comes to developing a teaching persona or identity. The chart on this slide illustrates where I see some of these connections happening. The far left column lists the necessary elements of being a library instructor, as discussed in the 2011 text, Becoming Confident Teachers, A Guide for Academic Librarians by Claire McGinnis. The column on the right lists values of pedagogy of vulnerability as discussed by Brenton Meyer. I bolded the areas where I see connections. So in summary, growing as a library educator is a vulnerable process, like I've just said. And it's something that's changing over time as our jobs change over time. And this is just a quick surface level look at those connections. Oops. Okay, sorry everyone, my slides are being kind of funky today. I also wanted to talk about some other pedagogies that librarians are talking about and working in, and I do see parallels to pedagogy of vulnerability. So again, even if we don't call it that, I think vulnerability is happening. And two pedagogies that I'm very passionate about and try to incorporate in my instruction as well is feminist pedagogy and critical pedagogy. I see many similarities here, specifically the work that other information professionals are doing with these pedagogies that I think align with vulnerability. I'd like to discuss a few examples, starting with the work of Maria Tiacardi, who wrote the groundbreaking text, Feminist Pedagogy for Library Instruction. In that text, Accardi shares their personal experience as being a feminist librarian and how incorporating those values in instruction kind of shapes what they perform in their job. And I see a lot of parallels in that text to being student-centered. Accardi talks about writing learning outcomes with a student-centered focus. Accardi also talks about sharing their own story, which is self-disclosure in a lot of ways. Another librarian working with feminist pedagogy that I am really interested in their work is Amanda Meeks. And one chapter that I have linked in my resources is Feminist Lib Guides from the Feminist Reference Desk, Concepts, Critiques, and Conversations. And in that chapter, Meeks discusses strategies they have taken to combat the traditionally oppressive structure of library guides. These strategies include embedding opportunities into the guides for students to add guide content and create opportunities for library students to review those library guides. So that's involving the students, opening conversation, building a community of learners, and also being student-centered, which I believe vulnerability is, right? We look at experiential knowledge and we talk with each other about it, which creates difficult conversations sometimes, but those conversations open the door for deep learning and active learning. So even though, this is entitled Pedagogy of Vulnerability, it is happening. There are elements of vulnerability there. So vulnerability in action then is really just looking at my own personal examples of using vulnerability in my instruction and job as an information professional. One example that I share from my graduate school years, I'm a visual literacy librarian, so I talk a lot about images. I teach with images a lot. I teach strategies for image searching. And one story I share with students is a story from graduate school. I was a graduate school minor in art history, and I remembered an assignment 10 minutes before my class started where I needed to look up an image from an artist that I like and bring it to class and present on the image for about 5 minutes. I panicked. I quickly Google searched Hannah Hawk, who I am a fan of, found the image on the left of this slide and chose it and brought it to class. It was a small class of people, but I shared about the image and why I liked it and why I chose it. And the instructor really let me talk the whole time. And when I sat down, she said, "This is not an image of an artwork by Hannah Hawk." It was so embarrassing, right? Because she caught me. I was like, it could very well not be. I did not know this work. I panicked. I forgot my assignment. And I'm not that type of person, which made it even worse. So I use this story and I show the image on the right, which is an actual piece by Hannah Hawk, to kind of give that warning of metadata is important. Using reliable resources is important. I didn't know at the time that the image on the left was from a blog, right? I panicked, and you should not panic. You should do your research and make sure that you are following and using reliable resources. So this is a personal story that I try to incorporate instruction, to let people know, to let students know, hey, I've forgotten an assignment too, even though I'm a librarian and I know what it's like. But save yourself the embarrassment and try to retrace your steps and give yourself time to do image research correctly. I also, I don't know, my slides are being so funky. I'm missing a slide, but basically I wanted to talk about my self-disclosure as someone who stutters. I disclose with pretty much everything that I do as a librarian. I have a self-disclosure in my email signature. I disclose in front of instruction and presentations, just like I did before this presentation. I work reference desk shifts, so I disclose on the phone to people because I struggle with talking on the phone. And one thing that has really taught me is it's prepared me to respond to how people respond with my self-disclosure. I've had students come up to me after class and tell me, hey, that was really cool. Some students have disclosed their own struggles to me after that. And that is something I, haven't always expected, but I always have the response, thank you so much for sharing that with me. And that's not to say that I'm trying to be inspirational or anything, but I do think it's cool that vulnerability creates this chain effect and people become more comfortable when you are comfortable with who you are. So while I know that not everyone stutters and not everyone has issues with instruction, I do think that there is a universal element there. If you hate teaching or you get nervous when you teach, there are elements of vulnerability that you can incorporate to make it a more pleasurable experience for you, an easier experience, and to make to help build that community in the classroom, even if it's just a one-shot instruction session, or maybe it's a learning module. There are techniques that you can use for trial and error there. And I spoke way too fast. So there will be time for questions at the end. But in conclusion, I'm just hoping that people will come away with a few things from this presentation. And if you don't remember anything else, I'm hoping people will be interested in pedagogy of vulnerability and know that it means incorporating student-focused teaching practices, which include active learning, deep learning, and incorporating lived curriculum into the classroom to build community. And while there are challenges to incorporating aspects of these pedagogical practices into our work as information professionals, it is possible. And sometimes it, requires creative thinking. But if we're good at anything, we're great at that. We're great at many things, but that is something that I think librarians excel at, is we're great on our feet and we're very creative individuals. So I think that we can incorporate and be creative in how we incorporate these practices into every area of our profession. So I'm going to share my slides because I know that text is small and there isn't a lot of time to look at resources, but I do have my resources and I also have a recommended read slide. So I will definitely share these slides. I know that this is being recorded as well. I talked so fast. I'm so sorry, Sarah. It was 50 minutes when I practiced. But if anyone has any questions, please let me know. I'm just so grateful to be a part of this conference, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Jackie. This has been amazing. And I do encourage everyone to share your questions in chat. You reminded me of something I learned late in life, which I think is an important part of what you've been saying in your presentation, is that you are more powerful if you share your story. And sometimes that even means sharing it with your colleagues. So you were talking about being, being a teaching librarian, and how most of us were thrown into that role without given much guidance. And I think one of the things that I find really important about building a community of librarians such as this one is the fact that you can share those stories and allow yourself to share the bad as well as the good.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's so important. And I find if I'm, for some reason, I like to be the person that shares first. I have some comfort in that level for whatever reason. And I find that it really is a chain effect. And it's so, I always learn so much, from people who are vulnerable as well. And that's why I'm just grateful to be a part of this. But I totally agree.
Teresa has a question. Have other librarians at your institution followed your lead with following the pedagogy of vulnerability as well? If so, how has it worked out?
That's a great question. So I'm very involved with feminist and critical pedagogy. I guess until you said that, I wasn't really even calling it that in my head or noticing that others were following suit. So I gave a presentation with two colleagues of mine. One is the head of media services, and the other is the media services and gender studies librarian. And we talked about media literacy and visual literacy in that presentation, and we split it into 3 parts. So Mo, head of media services, covered media literacy, and Mo is African American. So she used examples from her own experience of watching clips of Rodney King and George Floyd and really personalized everything that she was saying. I talked about visual literacy, but I used my experiences as a person who stutters. And I talked a little bit about neurodiversity and how I tried to use examples from artists with disabilities. I played a clip of the artist talking about their artwork who had a stutter. And then my colleague, Nikolai, talked about Native American identity and media literacy. And Nikolai is Native American. So we really started our presentations by saying, hey, this is who we are as librarians and as people, and this is how we try to advocate for these topics in our work. So that was actually, I did not come up with that concept. My colleague Mo came up with it. And what introduced that is my email signature, which I see another question about that I can definitely share. Sorry, I don't know where that slide went. I had it, but so basically, Mo saw my email signature and said, hey, I think it's really cool you did that. Would you be interested in pairing up on a presentation? And we actually ended up giving that presentation 5 times last year. So it seemed to be something people were interested in, and it was really rewarding to be, approached by other colleagues who were interested in teaming up on the vulnerability thing with me. I do think that's my biggest example of, kind of being vulnerable with other people. When I did that in my profession at my institution, when I did that interview, I heard from everyone that I work with in the library who were just really encouraging to me. And I think that was huge for me also, is to just say, hey, I think that's really cool. And that wasn't necessarily them following suit, but that was them kind of recognizing the vulnerability in the things that I was accomplishing in the library. Oops. So I did see, sorry, I'm just reading the questions. Okay, so this is the recommended read slide. These are readings pulled out from my bibliography. I'm happy to share more. I'm a huge recommended reads fan. I love when people give me, suggestions for reading. So if you want to learn further beyond what I have on this slide, please feel free to email me. I can put my email in the chat as well. Just making sure I don't miss any questions. Thank you so much for the questions. I love this. So have I talked with or to teaching faculty about teaching with vulnerability? I have not explicitly talked to teaching faculty about it, but I have talked to them about my self-disclosure because a lot of the times, most of the time, I prefer always when the teaching faculty is in the room when I come to teach their class. And I've gotten a lot of emails from faculty saying, just being very kind and very impressed, for lack of a better word, with the self-disclosure that I have. And I'm very grateful for that. I have never been told anything beyond, I think that's great. I think what you're doing is great. So no one has really asked me too many questions about it. But most of the time, I think that they've never encountered self-disclosure like that, because it just seems like, oh, wow, is their reaction. So I haven't talked about pedagogy of vulnerability explicitly with instructors, but I have talked about feminism and critical pedagogy, and I see a lot of overlaps there. So I think the potential for talking explicitly with faculty about vulnerability is definitely there. Yes, I can share more about my disclosure in my email. So I'm not gonna, let's see. Sorry for the slide changes for just a second. I really am kicking myself that slide is not here. But in the beginning of my presentation, if you see this kind of this box at the bottom of this slide that says I stutter. I may repeat words or sounds or perhaps be unable to speak at all. Please be patient with me. For more information about stuttering, contact the National Stuttering Association. That is the disclosure I have in my email signature. So I have my normal, contact information, my name, and at the bottom there is this box. And this box actually has led to a future publication for a CRL. I have written a chapter. There's a new volume series coming out. I'm not sure exactly when it's coming out, but I wrote a chapter about transformative learning and kind of incorporating vulnerability into that learning from the point of view of a library instructor who stutters. So I get comments from other librarians all the time who want to learn more about where I got that. To me, this was just an easy way, because when I first started this job, I was so scared about the reactions of people, and I didn't really necessarily want to tell them that I had a stutter. I've changed that point of view, but at first, having this email signature really made it easy for me because I didn't have to say anything. Even before I met people, they would see this signature, and it made my life a lot easier. And it really kind of helped normalize self-disclosure in my life. So my email signature, again, I really apologize for not having that slide, but my email signature self-disclosure is that box on this slide. Yeah, I can talk about my transition slides. Yeah, of course, Stephanie, thank you for your question. So these are quotes from Brené Brown. I chose these quotes because I'm trying to drive home like the importance of vulnerability and the benefits of it, even if it's just for developing your own identity as an instructor, So for me, these were quotes that I had come across reading her books that really spoke to me and the experiences that I was having as I was developing my own professional identity. So this quote, "You're imperfect and you're wired for struggle, but you are worthy of love and belonging," right? So we all can experience and relate to this quote. Even though I did not know any other instructors who stuttered or other librarians, after being vulnerable about it, I've connected with other librarians who have speech impediments. So this is kind of just pointing to that. Like, it is worth putting yourself out there, and it is worth connecting with people because you learn more. You really just learn more and you build community. Oops, sorry for flipping through there. So being vulnerable is being uncomfortable, right? When I published, or when I was involved in that interview, I was uncomfortable. And if I've learned anything from that interview, that being vulnerable in the right ways is worth it. Walking the tightrope of vulnerability, as Brené Brown calls it, which it is trickier with instruction, where there's that side of being vulnerable in a way that is relevant to instruction and that encourages active and deep learning. And on the other side, librarians are not therapists, and you don't want to veer off in the wrong ways, but it is worth it when you are able to be vulnerable, get uncomfortable, and be present with people without sacrificing who you are. So kind of incorporating your own identity into the development of your librarian educator identity. That's the reason I put this quote in there. It's kind of driving home that being vulnerable as a person, being vulnerable as a person and kind of incorporating your own personality into your development as a librarian. I think there's one more. So again, even as I'm talking these out loud, I realize they're really related to my connection between stuttering and vulnerability. So I understand that these might not, be things that everyone can relate to, but I think that I really believe that being a library educator there's a lot of vulnerability in that, and kind of owning that, hey, I need to learn and I can learn from my peers is a vulnerable thing and a humbling thing. So this quote kind of connects to that for me, and I'll just read it. Owning our story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing we'll ever do. That's a rich quote. All of these quotes are very rich, but that's kind of how I was connecting it to what I'm talking about. And there's one more. Okay. And we deny our stories, they define us. When we own our stories, we get to write a brave new ending. Again, now as I'm talking through these, I'm like, oh yeah, stuttering, that's what I was doing. I'm trying to relate this to everyone, but for me, I got my dream job. I was very excited about it, but I hated that I stuttered, and I did not want to go to speech therapy. And I kept trying to shove it away, and it kept coming up, right? So, going to speech therapy and learning and kind of humbling myself in that way has turned into, now I'm talking about it at presentations, right? So, and having rewarding experiences and trying to tell people about it so they can also have rewarding experiences and grow as educators. So again, another rich quote. If you don't know Brene Brown, please look up her Netflix special and her YouTube videos. She's not she doesn't know everything because she's human, but I think she's a great introduction to the topic of vulnerability and vulnerability as a research area. Oh, I'm so glad. Okay. I realize as I'm talking out loud, I'm like, oh, these quotes made so much sense in my head, and I'm hoping they do. But just kind of driving home the vulnerability thing. Thank you, Erin. Oh, I'm so glad, Sarah. Thank you so much. It is very inspiring. Yes. I highly recommend the special on Netflix. And I'll just go back to my first slide with my email. I will put my email in the chat as well. And I'm happy to share more reading recommendations. Please just let me know. Sorry, you're seeing all these flashes of slides, but I will put my email in there.
While you're doing that, Jackie, I'll just close this out if that's all right.
Yeah.
First and foremost, by saying thank you. This was an amazing session, and it's been very meaningful to me, and I have learned a lot, and so I hope everyone else has too. And I do want to thank everyone for attending today. The recording will be available on our website after the conference. We will have a survey for assessing our sessions, and we really hope that you'll take some time to complete it so we can take your feedback and improve upon the experience next year as needed. And so I'm going to post some information in the chat, but thank you all very much for attending today.
Oh, thank you all so much. I'm very grateful to be here, and I appreciate all of the awesome questions.